Zach Duke with FinOsec again. Want to spend some time today talking a little bit about the FFIEC guidance that recently came out on cloud computing. Our team at FinOsec has spent a number of hours reviewing and digesting the expectations. Summary here is there's really no new guidance, but there are a couple of key takeaways we wanted to highlight as you're going through this process. First thing is, if at the end of this, I'll have my contact information. If you want to have the highlighted version that I'm going to go through today in the PDF, I'll be happy to share that with you. This came out actually in May of 2020, and it clearly set some expectations of security in a cloud computing environment. If you think of May 2020, we're right in the scenario of trying to work and deal with pandemic, remote workers, remote usage, cloud computing. At the same time, vendor management and vendors are continuing to leverage cloud computing, right? So really they talk about effective risk management. One of the things that was interesting is between talking about a shared responsibility, and you'll see this theme come through as we talk through this discussion between the cloud service provider and their financial institution clients. So they're putting some clear expectations on the cloud service provider, but they have some hooks and expectations they want you to have in place as a financial institution as you're going through that, okay? And you'll see, statement does not contain any new regulatory expectations, but it highlights kind of their expectations, right? So it talks a little bit about background expectations. Management should not assume. For me personally, when I see that, I have a vision of my sixth grade teacher who wrote assume up on the chalkboard and circled the U, right? Again, childhood scar. So I digress. But the key takeaway is management at your institution should not assume that we have the right things in place. You really need to manage and make sure that there's effectiveness related to security operations and resiliency controls associated. They do talk a lot about the contractual agreement, SLAs, ways for you to hold the vendor accountable. And that is a more detailed look. Again, not new guidance, but more of a detailed look on their expectations and what they're looking for, specifically with the ongoing oversight and management. They talk about some different types, software as a service, platform as a service. Now, one of the things that I took away here is it says here the financial institution is responsible for user-specific application configuration settings. So one of the things in a software environment where it's software as a service is the institution is responsible for user access and identity management, right? So they are highlighting that component specifically. And actually in the future, they're going to talk a little bit about the need for frequent user review. So we'll talk through that in just a second. So ultimately, they say again, the financial institution retains overall responsibility of the safety and soundness of the cloud services. And really the lens is it's all around the crown jewels, right? Protecting sensitive information. How do we make sure we're protecting, social security number, account numbers, usernames, passwords, et cetera, from that side. Now, you'll talk about the risks. Again, careful review of the contract, management's failure to understand the division of responsibilities. What's your responsibility as the institution? What's the cloud service providers? One of the things we see a lot with our customers when we're having initial kickoffs and conversations is the lack of clarity on user access and permissions. So that's one thing I would absolutely highlight. You need to make sure you get your arms around is least privilege, making sure we have a validation of those access points, et cetera. They talk about the IT strategic plan and the ongoing need for due diligence and oversight. Now, the contractual responsibilities are really interesting, right? So they talk about the need for service level agreements, specifically talking about who is responsible for what. Typical cloud computing contracts we've seen don't always define the responsibilities of these activities in the contract. So that's something I would just take away as a need to do in your vendor management process. They also want to make sure that you have an inventory process. I would equate that to a system map of understanding where the information assets are and if they're cloud or hosted and not on-premise. There's some cool ways and unique things that we put in place that I've seen institutions leverage. Happy to share those with you if you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I track that? What's that process look like? They talk about configuration, provisioning, logging, and monitoring. Again, this gets into user access, permissions, and again, this identity access management and network controls. So if you've seen my videos in the past, the FDIC and OCC put out a joint statement in January of 2020. This is about 4 months before this guidance or new update came out. And their expectations were really clear around identity access management, user authentication and validation, right? So again, they're coming back to that same concept. Now this one, frequently updating and reviewing account access. So they're talking about the need for frequent. So in all guidance we've had in the past, it's been listed as periodic. In the January release in the FDIC and OCC joint statement, we saw a change from periodic to regular. And now they're talking about frequent access, specifically focusing on a privileged user access and making sure that we have tools designed to detect security misconfigurations and network controls, right? They also talk about your need for security controls of sensitive data, things like encryption, validation, DLP, right? Data loss prevention tools, making sure those systems are done. And another thing to put on your employee training list is information security and awareness training programs specifically for cloud services. So what do we allow? What do we not allow? What is the process? If they're a vendor management, how do we make sure that they understand the needs and the obligations that we need for them to make sure that they're managing? Now, another thing that we really haven't seen specific components around is this concept of change management. And change management is difficult, especially in a cloud environment or a shared model, right? Where the vendor or your partner has the ability of changing things and expectations. And you need to be able to make sure if you're in a managed services or a cloud services solution, how do you know when the vendor is making changes? How do you document those things? Right? We don't want to just have them have access and assume that they're doing their things correctly, right? We want to be able to have a process and a mechanism to be able to validate changes on the system. That could be security updates, that could be configuration changes, that could be enhancements, that could just even be support tickets and working with your team and provisioning and deprovisioning systems in a cloud environment. Now, business resiliency and recovery, candidly, from my perspective, I think this is where cloud services shine. But you need to have a process in place and make sure that that vendor and the partner that you have has correctly configured and outlined the process. So just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean business resiliency and recovery has been addressed. So we want to make sure we have a process for that. What's the testing? What's the validation process? You know, as a senior manager, how do you go and facilitate that? Essentially, they also go into incident response capabilities, and they talk about the need as an organization for you to know what's your responsibility, what's the cloud service provider's responsibility. So in April of 2020, we actually had a attack that happened, or actually it's March of 2020, right in the middle of the, hey, we're going to start working from home, pandemic, COVID-19, right, dynamic. Finastra was hit with a broad scale ransomware attack. Now, they were able to recover and protect the information. I'm sure it created a lot of stress and anxiety on their teams, let alone the financial institutions that were managing those systems, right? But the clearness of this becomes, okay, what if your cloud service provider gets compromised? What are you supposed to do as an institution? What are they supposed to do? I would also say regular testing and validation of that process. Now, the controls assessment in cloud service provider managed controls. So there's two things that they highlight here. One is they want to make sure that the financial institution has controls and are checked. That's going to be your audit. That's going to be your validation process, right? Now, on the cloud service provider managed controls, they talk about report of compliance with service level agreements. So really what they're wanting here is for you to have a service level agreement with the cloud service provider, and then not just stop there, have a report from the vendor validating their adherence to that SLA. So I haven't seen really good reporting from an SLA perspective from the vendor community. And I think this is one of the things to highlight just as a fintech banking technology association group, right? We need to start thinking about how do we manage these things and this expectation from a regulatory guidance. Additionally, they talk about background checks. Most vendors I see in the space, they do background checks, but are they doing security awareness training? What's the documentation on that look like? So again, there's been a couple of nuggets in here that are just new and unique that we pulled out. They talk about controls that are unique, specific to cloud computing services. Candidly, I could spend a lot of time talking into the specifics of these. I want to make this video short in nature, so I'm not going to go through a bunch of detail there. But the other component that they talk about is really what happens if you leave the vendor, right? So things like portability of the data and services, how do you unwind that partnership? And if they have your data, can you make sure that they actually destroy in the event of a contract cancellation? So my hope is hopefully this gives you a little bit of a summary. There's some really good detail in here. Of course, it's written in a very broad nature, right? If it's FFIEC, it's for the small community institution all the way up to the big boys, and there's challenges with that. But if you have any questions, I've got my contact information at the end. Is happy to share and respond to you, and appreciate your time today as I went through it.